Okay, I think it's time to begin. Welcome to From the Original New Deal to the Green New Deal, a conversation sponsored by the Living New Deal's New York City branch. My name is Peggy Crane, and I'm the chief cook and bottle washer around these parts. We're a special project of the Living New Deal, the California nonprofit that has been mapping New Deal sites around the country, more than 16,000 and counting, and bringing public attention to what the New Deal accomplished during an extraordinary decade in our country's history. Tonight, we're going to look at the promise and prospects for a Green New Deal. Notice that I just switched a part of speech on you. Instead of saying the Green New Deal, I said a Green New Deal, because the Green New Deal is still mainly aspirational. When FDR promised the country a New Deal, he didn't have something like the Code of Hammurabi in mind. A whole series of programs and policies in response to the Great Depression, the New Deal involved a lot of trial and error, and a Green New Deal will too. Lucky for us, we can look back as we look forward. We did it once, and we can do it again. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator, Kevin Baker, a Renaissance man if there ever was one. Kevin is an award-winning novelist, historian, and journalist. He recently completed a book on the history of New York City baseball and is currently working on a cultural and political history of the United States between the wars, for which he received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2017. He has written for numerous publications, newspapers, and magazines, and is a contributing editor to Harper's Magazine. So please take it away, Kevin.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Peggy, and thank you for all the hard work you put in into making tonight happen, and for doing such a really terrific job keeping the Living New Deal in New York going through all these months of pandemic. Thanks to everyone for Zooming in tonight, and thanks especially to our panelists for coming here through the internet. Although I will issue a quick warning, you're not dealing with Chris Wallace tonight. So anyone steps out of line and, here goes the mic. We have been at this crossroads before. The Great Depression in the United States was an environmental collapse every bit as much as it was an economic collapse. Twin peaks of a systemic civilizational crisis of unprecedented but entirely foreseeable and preventable proportions, as Professor Sheila Collins has characterized it. It marked the endpoint of how we had always done things as a people. Then, as now, we could see it and feel it and literally breathe what was happening to us, what had gone wrong, and how our world was changing. By the 1930s, according to Professor Collins's estimates, 5/6 of the original indigenous animal population that had existed in America when Europeans arrived had been wiped out. 7/8 of the original woodlands had been cut down and cleared. 1/6 of the topsoil in the United States had blown away in the ecological disaster that was the Dust Bowl. It was only in stopping and reversing this destruction, as much as anything else, that the New Deal was able to stop and reverse the economic collapse of the Great Depression and provide us with an example of how to proceed into the future. Here to launch our discussion of what is to be done now is our main speaker, Robert Kutner. Mr. Kutner has been a distinguished reporter, commentator, educator, and public servant for some 50 years. He is the co-founder and the very patient, as I know from personal experience, co-editor of the American Prospect, our leading journal of liberal ideas. A native of New York City, Mr. Kutner has also written for and edited publications ranging from the Village Voice to the New Republic, Business Week to the Washington Post, as well as the American Prospect. He has served in the arena as a chief investigator for the U.S. Senate Banking Committee and as executive director of President Carter's National Commission on Neighborhoods. He is the author of 12 books, including Everything for Sale, The Limits and Virtues of Markets, Can Democracy Survive Capitalism, and just out, his work on the forthcoming presidential election we are all awaiting so eagerly, The Stakes. Maybe less eagerly. I think the best thing that can be said about last night is that that the Yankees won. Um, Currently, the Meyer and Ida Kirstein Professor at Brandeis University's Heller School, Mr. Kutner is also taught at Boston University, the University of Oregon, the University of Massachusetts, and Harvard's Institute of Politics. He is a two-time winner of the Sidney Hillman Journalism Award, as well as the John Hancock Award for Financial Writing, the Jack London Award for Labor Writing, and the Paul Hoffman Award from the United Nations Development Program for his lifetime of work on economic efficiency and social justice. Won't you please welcome, by muting your microphones as soon as you finish clapping, Mr. Robert Kutner.
Well, Kevin, thanks so much. And this is a reunion because we worked together on the Prospects special issue on a Green New Deal about a year ago, to which you contributed a very important piece. Thanks to Peggy for pulling this together, and thanks to all of you who are watching and to the panel. I want to suggest that this generation has a rendezvous, not necessarily a rendezvous with destiny, but a rendezvous of four urgent imperatives. The most urgent of all, of course, is to save the planet. But we also have the imperative of economic recovery from the COVID depression. We have the imperative of rebuilding public infrastructure, which has decayed disgracefully, in contrast to the New Deal, which rebuilt public infrastructure. And we have the imperative of reclaiming American leadership in technology and industry and green innovation. All of these taken together have the promise of creating millions and millions of good jobs. And all of them, of course, will cost a great deal of money. Now, the analogy to the original New Deal as a touchstone is evident. I mean, first of all, it connotes large-scale government effort at a time of national crisis and common purpose. But the New Deal metaphor also has its limits. While the New Deal built bridges, houses, planted trees, and employed millions of people in public works projects, it did not cure the Great Depression. New Deal deficits never exceeded 6% of GDP. The New Deal did use activist government to fire the public imagination and to rally a national sense of public purpose, and to make it clear that we needed government to restrain the excesses of private capitalism. But even so, unemployment remained stuck above 12% until the World War II buildup. So I want to suggest that the Great Depression and the World War II buildup, both of which, of course, were part of the Roosevelt administration, should be seen as all of a piece. Now, the war ran deficits as high as 25% of GDP. It used a combination of surtaxes on the rich as high as over 90%, with extensive public borrowing. And what we need today is a World War II scale effort, but without the war. Now, I grant you this is difficult in branding terms. Green New Deal has much better resonance than Green World War II. But the Roosevelt administration really should be seen as all of a piece. Look at what World War II accomplished. We reached full employment. It was a training policy. It was a technology policy. It relied on public planning and public capital. It brought the labor movement, even to a greater extent in the Wagner Act, into full partnership with industry as a full social partner. Government was the coordinator of a massive economic rebuilding and a recapitalizing of American industry, and a repression, a salutary repression of private finance through a deal that the Federal Reserve had with the Treasury to basically borrow as much or finance as much borrowing as the Treasury needed to create at interest rates of about 2.5%. The war used a great deal of public capital, and it demonstrated that even when times are relatively good, the economy often has a great deal more potential than we think it does. And that government, representing public democracy as opposed to private economic power, has the capacity to steer resources into new sectors. Now, in the case of a Green New Deal, the analogy is obvious. These sectors are the unrealized potential of a post-carbon economy, where more people have decent living standards at a lower material toll on the planet, and where racial justice is built into the approach. The private sector is simply not capable of defining, combining, and attaining these goals. On the contrary, private investors, private traders, corporate owners, despite rhetoric about socially responsible investing, actively resist this sort of economy because it requires giving the people and their government too much power at the expense of private capital. A second lesson of the combined wartime and New Deal experience, analogous to the Green New Deal that we need today, is that public investment in new technologies that do not yet have adequate market demand can lead to massive gains in technological breakthrough and productivity. The entire history to date of the shift to renewable energy is one of government intervening to alter the tax and regulatory favoritism for carbon fuels, altering pricing structures so that renewables can compete, and allowing a post-carbon economy to play to its natural advantage. In China, the government simply subsidized producers of solar and wind so that they became the low-cost global producer. The United States could do likewise. And here again, a New Deal or World War II scale commitment would allow us to get to zero carbon so much faster than waiting for the market, which is infamous for not pricing in externalities. Lord Nicholas Stern famously termed global climate change history's greatest case of market failure. This is one of the many reasons why we need government. One more lesson of World War II, and here I'm drawing in part on a Roosevelt Institute paper by Josh Mason that I very highly recommend on the lessons of World War II, is that a massive public investment in a new sector, in this case, the green economy, need not require an overall decline in living standards, but simply a redefinition of what we mean by living standards. During the war, overall civilian consumption actually increased despite the massive military buildup because the economy had been so slack and not realizing its potential. Here again, the analogy to a green conversion is very important. Now, there are some people of the degrowth school who believe that because the material toll on the planet is generally excessive, that we all just need to adapt to reduce living standards. Candidly, I think that's something of a political non-starter. For too many people, for too many Americans, especially people of color, they've never had a shot at the American dream. And a lot of white working class people who once had a piece of the dream have been suffering downward mobility since the 1980s because financial elites have taken too much of the cake. These are the same elites who would destroy the planet. And this is, of course, the soil in which Trumpism grows. So try going to Rust Belt states where factory jobs once paid a middle-class standard of living and telling people, black or white, that they need to tighten their belts yet again for the good of the planet. But a green transition does give us a chance to redefine prosperity. Prosperity can mean cheaper, more reliable post-carbon electricity. It can mean cheaper public high-speed internet. It can mean green jobs and zero net energy housing and safer, cleaner air and water. A Green New Deal and a post-carbon economy need to be promoted along with a more just economy as a strategy of economic prosperity with a lower material toll on the planet, but not as belt tightening. And once again, the private sector is simply not going to deliver that transition. That's why we need a public Green New Deal. Now, I want to take a few minutes and talk about some of the other difficult questions, and I hope we will get into these in more detail in the planet. For starters, how do we pay for this? Now, book-length treatises have been written on this. I think, as in the case of World War II, it's one part public borrowing and one part surtaxes on the wealthy. We can begin by rescinding Trump's $2 trillion tax cut for the rich, which was enacted in 2017. But also, equally important, perhaps even more important, recent experience shows that we can use credit creation by the Federal Reserve to a far greater degree than was once thought possible without triggering inflation or a run on the dollar. Since the financial collapse of 2008, the Fed has increased credit creation as necessary. Now, the austerity mongers then and now have fretted that this would lead to government borrowing, crowding out business borrowing, and raising interest rates, but this just did not happen. Interest rates and inflation rates have stayed very low, even during the pre-COVID boom, when employment was under 4%. And in the current downturn, the Fed's credit creation has exceeded $6 trillion. It has just gone to all the wrong places. It's gone mostly to pumping up Wall Street. And it just as easily could finance green public infrastructure bonds or investment in domestic green technologies. Now, there's a school of thought called modern monetary theory, which holds that the government's capacity to create credit is almost infinite until, as long as it leads to real increases in productivity, until we reach capacity constraints, and then supply starts moving up prices. And at that point, we have to pull back. But until we do, ahead. I don't go quite as far as some of the more passionate exponents of modern monetary policy, but I think the Fed's action in creating credit and channeling it mostly to Wall Street shows what is possible if the Federal Reserve, as it was during the Roosevelt era, were more of an institution whose constituency was the general public and not Wall Street. There's also an explicit case for public capital, as in the case, again, using the original New Deal analogy, of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or the TVA. All the great creative uses of public capital, not public-private partnerships, which are mostly bogus, but genuine public capital. Another tricky issue is what I call the kitchen sink problem. Some of the groups who used the phrase Green New Deal included everything from affordable housing to national health insurance, basically the entire progressive wish list. Just on tactical grounds and on branding grounds, if you will, I'm a little skeptical of that. I think the risk is that if we pile every good thing onto the Green New Deal agenda, we risk diluting the agenda, and we also risk sinking the ship. Now, I suppose you could argue that if you look at the New Deal as a whole, it included FHA for housing. It included expanded social insurance. It virtually invented social insurance with the Social Security Act, and so maybe we just ought to do that when we use the phrase Green New Deal. But I think if you add up the trillions and trillions of dollars that we need to modernize public infrastructure and to create green public infrastructure, and the other investments we need in new technology, and the post-carbon investments, and the investments in a just transition for workers who are in the carbon economy, plus the more temporary things we need to get out of the COVID depression, that's a lot. And maybe we should just keep focus on the aspects of the Green New Deal that are explicitly green. But that doesn't mean that we should duck thinking big. We need to think very big, because the original New Deal was about thinking very big. Think of the TVA as the quintessential example of transformative public capital. Now, there's also a short-run politics and a long-run politics to a Green New Deal. In order to achieve a sustainable economy and get public consent for the kind of scale of public investment that we need, several things are going to have to break right politically. First, of course, Biden needs to defeat Trump, and he needs to take with him a working majority in Congress. Biden will need to propose outlays on an adequate scale to get this done and win their enactment by Congress. And in addition to creating a medium-term path to sustainability, a lot of this needs to be front-loaded. because 2 years away is the midterm election of 2022. And if Biden, God willing, does not deliver some tangible things by 2022, he'll get blown away by the usual midterm jinx. Roosevelt avoided that. 1934 was one of the very few midterm elections after a new president took office in American history, where the president's party actually gained seats. And one of the reasons that happened was that even though it took the New Deal a while to get into high gear, thanks to Harry Hopkins and the Civil Works Administration, later rebranded as the WPA, millions of jobs were in fact created in the first year. They were jobs that sometimes just used to pick and shovel, but they put a lot of people back to work. And so by 1934, when he was trying to get Democrats elected to Congress so that he could keep the momentum going, Roosevelt could point to a lot of tangible activity. Some of the bigger projects like TVA, Bonneville Dam, that took longer. And yet, some of this needs to be front-loaded. And I think we have a counterexample in the Obama era Recovery Act, which was too small, which was viewed as counter-cyclical economic stimulus rather than a down payment on long-deferred public investment. And unfortunately, the deficit hawks got hold of it. The mantra was timely, targeted, and temporary rather than big and bold. And as a result, there was not enough to show for it by 2010, and the Democrats lost 63 seats in the House, which was the worst drubbing that a new president's party took in more than a century. So very important, even though a lot of this stuff is going to take 5, 10, 15 years, to have something to show for it in the first couple of years. Here is another hard question, and it's the trade-off between getting things done and getting them done fast and making sure there's plenty of community participation. At the time of the original New Deal, we did not have environmental impact statements. We had Robert Moses running roughshod over the sensibility of neighbors. How do we reconcile this? My home is Boston, and I vividly remember the so-called Big Dig, which was a combination of turning the highway that scarred the city into a tunnel and building another tunnel to the airport and modernizing several subway lines. And the Secretary of Transportation at the time was a magnificent guy named Freddie Salvucci, who came out of the anti-freeway movement and who was determined that there would be exemplary neighborhood participation, that nobody's house would be torn down unless it was absolutely necessary, and neighborhood groups would have a lot of input into the actual design of what the Big Dig brought us. Well, God bless Freddie Salvucci. Unfortunately, that took a little time. And one of the unfortunate hallmarks of the Big Dig was it seemed to take forever. So how do we square that circle? Now, World War II was a true national emergency, and so it cut a lot of red tape in order to mobilize full production. But the war mobilization commandeered entire industries. It commandeered the auto industry. There were no civilian cars built between 1942 and 1945 so that they could be converted to tanks and aircraft and ships and everything else that we needed for the war effort. We had wage and price controls. Climate change is also an emergency. But how do we reconcile the scale of public outlay and public planning that we need with bottom-up, small d, democratic planning? What roles for communities and different levels of government? What do we do in Republican-controlled states which are hostile to the entire enterprise? How much is federal? How much is state and local? Another very important analogy is the Green New Deal as regional economic development. Even though the Green New Deal was federal, the fact that there are 15 or 16,000 sites tell you that a lot of it was local. And if you think about how a rural electrification co-op works, that's the epitome of local citizen participation. The TVA was the ultimate project of regional economic development for an entire region. So what's today's counterpart? And I want to give you a couple of examples. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, there's a splendid example of a public entity which is the legacy of TVA, using its resources to promote regional economic development, but acting locally. The Public Power Company, called EPB, offers ultra-high-speed internet at rates far cheaper than commercial competitors, and this benefits not only consumers, but allows Chattanooga to position itself as a locale that is attractive to high-tech firms who need very high-speed broadband. In the old industrial town of Holyoke, Massachusetts, where we begin with a public power company based on hydro, which added a massive solar farm, the two things together give it the cheapest electricity in the state, which in turn has allowed it to create a computing center for all of the Boston area universities and to market itself as a center of back office data collection. So the paradigm of clean, green technology and public economic development is yet another benefit of the Green New Deal, with echoes of the original New Deal. And this, of course, connects to two other goals. One is a just transition. Millions of workers in the old carbon-based economy will lose their jobs when we get serious about a zero carbon economy. Both as a political matter and for the sake of simple fairness, we need a serious plan that would partly pension off older workers and re-employ others at good wages. For a relatively small number of skilled workers who have a lot of political influence in the dirty carbon economy, from mine workers to pipeline workers to offshore drilling workers, the conditions are hazardous, but the pay is good. We need those workers in our coalition. And by the same token, climate justice needs to be part and parcel of this entire project. Poorer communities, communities of color, have borne the brunt of the dirty economy, reflected in everything from higher rates of asthma to polluting plants being located in lower income neighborhoods, and poor people being disproportionately exposed to lead-based paints and toxics in water supplies. A Green New Deal needs to invert these priorities. The Roosevelt administration expanded the public sphere, showed that it was often more efficient as well as more fair and more productive than its private for-profit counterparts. And by doing so, it won broad support for the premise that public institutions were necessary to improve our lives. For the past several decades, administrations of both parties have promoted privatization and disparaged government. Republicans more than Democrats, but Democrats have sometimes found it expedient to pile on. A Green New Deal is an opportunity to restore our public household and restore the credibility of public household. And we better do this right, because if we do it wrong, the opportunity is not going to come around again for a very long time. And finally, there is the global dimension. Climate is, of course, a global challenge. Where do we pick off? Where do we pick up? How do we pick up where we left off before Trump reversed even the modest progress of the Obama era? How do we both rebuild a green economy at home and help the rest of the world get to sustainability? So I appreciate so very much your having invited me to kick this off, and I hope the panel will shed light on these and other important questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much for that, Bob. That was terrific, and I think really was a great summary of what the challenges are and what the opportunities are. So to let me to introduce the panel, I'd like to start our all-star panel here. I'd like to start with Mr. Mitchell J. Silver, who is not only the Commissioner of New York City's Department of Parks, but also one of America's most celebrated urban thinkers and doers. In his role as Parks Commissioner, Mr. Silver manages and plans for our nearly 30,000 acres of city parkland. And this is an incredibly diverse portfolio, one that includes our parks, playgrounds, beaches, marinas, recreation centers, untrammeled nature, such as it still is in New York. Commissioner Silver is also President-elect of the American Institute of Certified Planners and the former president of the American Planning Association. He was named one of the 100 most influential urbanists by the website Planetism, Planet Citizen in 2017, and has been honored as one of the top 100 city innovators in the world by UBM Future Cities. Commissioner Silver.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Robert. So delighted to be here. In Robert's remarks, he mentioned Robert Moses. I work now in Central Park, and literally behind that door was Robert Moses' office. So I get to be the anti-Robert Moses and try to correct a lot of things that he did not get right. There's always two Robert Moses, the pre-war and the post-war. Pre-war expanded a lot of recreation for the city. Post-war, a lot of destruction to a lot of neighborhoods. Well, I for one support the Green New Deal. It is certainly necessary. As Parks Commissioner, I will stay in a space that parks and public space. Certainly as we urbanize in the 21st century, there's no question that we are going to need more and more green space. Even if you look back at the 1918 pandemic, after that very unfortunate event, we saw an explosion of green space really throughout the country. And so I expect the same today. But the reason why I bring up that point is that parks and public spaces do not sit in isolation. In the 21st century, these are not just green spaces that sit in isolation behind a fence or a wall. They're now going to be integrated into the fabric of our cities and our places. Parks are not just for physical health, they're also for mental health. And as we go forward, and I understand the Green New Deal, usually they're the 3 E's about the environment, the economy, and about equity. I'm very focused on people as we grow. We're going to add billions of people to our planet, and it's critically important that we offset density with open space, and it happens to be green space. So the reason why I say that is that climate change is a serious issue. This city and its mayor believes in climate change. I believe in climate change. And we're trying to do our part in local government to try to address some of these emerging challenges that we're facing. And here in New York City, we don't just look at parks as just, as I said, sitting in isolation. We want to make sure they play more roles than just providing physical and mental health. For one, we want to make sure that we have a strong urban canopy throughout our city to absorb carbon dioxide, to cool our city, and provide the reduced stress and anxiety of so many of our citizens, particularly in COVID, when they're running to our parks in record numbers. We want to use it for stormwater capture to make sure that our air quality and our water quality is good. And so when I look at a park, I look at it as basically one of our assistant healthcare workers to make sure we stay healthy, both we as a people, but also our planet. And so it's critically important that while we have 30,000 acres, we want to expand that even further because we understand the importance that green space has on the survival of our planet and also the survival of our people. We also recognize that our parks serve as the first line of defense against climate change. In New York City, we have 520 miles of coastline. We're a coastal city. And of that 520, about 155 miles happen to be parkland. We are now thinking differently about what our edge of our city looks like. And we're building it very differently to be more resilient and stronger for storm surges and sea level rise, which we take very seriously. So we're unleashing a $20 billion plan to make sure that at least New York City is protected. And that means lots of jobs, different technology, and a different style of living for both our state residents as well as our city residents. So we're taking this, as I said, very, very seriously. We're unleashing projects from the Lower East Side to the Rockaways, recognizing that climate change is real and we have no time to waste. We're very carefully looking at the projections from now up until 2050 and building a very different city. So as we embark on this New Deal, we want to recognize that we here in New York City have to be prepared. There will be some deniers. I'm not concerned about that. It is our job to prepare for both present, but also future generations. So we're taking it very seriously. Another point I wanted to make, and this is, I think, the only point I would differ from the New Deal of the 1930s. We're now in this era of equity, racial and social justice. And I think we all know while the FHA insured mortgages, it wasn't fair to all Americans. And this is where we saw a split in different communities, where whites had the opportunity to actually purchase homes, build wealth, pass it on to their children, But many Black people were not able to secure those mortgages. And as a result, they're regulated to very unsatisfying and now communities that are in low income, undesirable land uses, and they cannot build that wealth. The Green New Deal must be equitable. And as Robert stated in his remarks, a lot of those communities are facing the most undesirable land uses, from pollutants to asthma to health disparities. That as we look at a Green New Deal, we have to make sure it is equitable so that all, and I mean all, benefit from the Green New Deal. We're all in this together. And my concern is that we don't have a situation where we still have those moving forward, and then we have many, many communities, particularly people of color, being left behind. So I'm very optimistic about the future. I do believe we need a Green New Deal. We need bold, new thinking. I'm going to stay out of the politics. I'll stick to what I know best, and that is building and maintaining great cities. And so it's very important as we look at our parks and public space that we should no longer look at these as just these nice green places. They serve so much more in the 21st century, particularly as we're urbanizing, not just here in New York or the city, but the entire planet. So I challenge everyone who's listening that we must press forward. Why? Because our city needs us, our country needs us, but more importantly, our planet needs us. Now I'd like to introduce the next speaker, the panelist. Her name is Deborah Gardner. She is an historian in residence and a curator for Hunter College Roosevelt House, where she has produced numerous exhibitions. She has served on the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission and as a member of several preservation groups, including the Living New Deal. She has authored articles and books on many topics, including the history of the Roosevelts here in New York. I now give you Deborah Gardner.
Thank you, Mitchell. I'm delighted to be here, and good evening to everyone. In my talk, you should find echoes of both the past and the present. Topics introduced by Robert Kutner and Mitchell Silver. So what I'm going to do is take you through the sorry, I'm trying to get this to work now. We'll get this up in a moment. There we are. I'm going to take you through a PowerPoint which has some salient images which show you how the original New Deal had green elements to it. As the presidential election approached in November 1932, the country's economy was in tatters. This should sound familiar. And later, this became known as the Great Depression. Wall Street had crashed in 1929, banks had closed, and the destitute had been evicted from farms and homes. And here you see African-American sharecroppers who were thrown off land they had tilled for decades, and a migrant family also having been evicted from its home on the move, like hundreds of thousands of other Americans trying to find work. New York State Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected by a landslide in 1932, defeating Herbert Hoover, who had not been able to cope with the Depression. And Roosevelt pledged a New Deal for the American people. And during the election campaign and immediately afterwards, his cabinet and his advisors got to work with plans to put people back to work. And many of the programs where they were going to employ people, they were going to be working on environmental programs. As he would say later in 1936, government itself must, if it is to survive, recognize change and give to new needs reasonable and constant help. The greatest environmental disaster of the New Deal that had to be tackled was the Dust Bowl. The wide swath of country encompassing farm and wheatlands of the Great Plains, where the combination of a severe long-term drought and poor farming practices allowed vast storms to blow away the topsoil. And in the image on the left, you can see the sky dark at midday with soil being blown. And the image on the right by photographer Arthur Rothstein, an Oklahoma farm where a father and son and younger child hurried to get out of the dust. The dust was so severe that it blew to New York City, just like the fires have blown smoke to New York. And this was a feature in the New York Times on how severe the problems were, with many photographs by Dorothea Lange, a colleague of Arthur Rothstein, who both worked for the federal government photography project in the Farm Security Administration. One of the projects that was immediately launched with the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, was to plant trees and to create a belt that went from border to border in the Midwest with trees which would stop the winds which blew away the soil and help replenish the soil. And in this poster, you can see the contrast between a revived farmscape and one which had been decimated by the dust storms. Now, the CCC was formed within 2 months of Roosevelt's inauguration in March 1933. Here he is visiting a CCC camp, which had young men. There were only a few women who were hired into the program, who were formed and sent to camps run by the Army all over the country to aid in restoring forests as well as farmlands. And Roosevelt himself spoke about the need for restoration of water, soil, and forests. And here you can see some of these young men, 2 million of them eventually worked for the CCC. And it was a shame that when we did the temporary subsidies to improve the economy in 2008, that we didn't have a program to employ young people, not only in environmental matters, but in other forms of doing social good. This plaque on the right commemorates an all African-American regiment of the CCC. Of course, in that era, segregation was implanted deeply in the fabric of the country, and therefore many of these programs, while they employed African Americans and benefited African Americans, almost always did it on a segregated basis. The government used all kinds of means to tell people about what improvements they were making for them. And in this exhibit piece, you see a poor farmer and his old log cabin, and a farmer who'd been assisted by the government with a plentiful farmland and house. And here are pictures taken by Rothstein and others of farmers who've been successful in their plantings, including a little Hispanic boy holding up these supersized vegetables. And another of an African-American farmer, first with his old log cabin house, and later in a new community built by the Resettlement Administration with modern housing behind them. The Resettlement Administration helped educate all farmers who needed, the poorest farmers, on better agricultural practices, and provided very low interest loans so they could buy farms and build new housing. Another way that the New Deal provided for a Green New Deal in a sense was renewable energy. And this was in the dam building program, which was mentioned by Robert Kutner. The TVA built dams. Other agencies around the country built dams, such as Boulder Dam, which FDR visited in 1935 when it was almost done, where he talked about in the 100-degree heat and before 1,000 people, I came, I saw, and I was conquered, as is everyone would be who sees this great feat of mankind. And this is what the dam looked like. Now these dams, of course, provided water for electricity, for irrigation, and electricity to modernize homes and farms, as well as recreational opportunities through the lakes that were formed by the backing up of the waters. And here were women in a Tennessee community looking at plans for electrification, and a woman in her home with an electric fan and an electric iron, saving her a lot of labor. And her husband, if she was a farm wife, was probably in the barn using an electrical milking machine for his cows. Now, the CCC worked on those kinds of projects. They worked at Mount Rushmore and they worked in the parks. Commissioner Silver talked about how important parks are. The CCC worked in our national parks. They helped build over 800 state parks. And these were all available and free or almost free green spaces where visitors found new trails, new camping and lodging facilities, and they might have been seen as the lungs of the nation, to paraphrase Frederick Law Olmsted, who had famously said that parks were the lungs of the city. And of course, as Professor Silver said, millions of dollars were spent in New York alone on these existing parks and creating new ones with recreational facilities. That was the good Robert Moses that he referred to, who brought in astounding amounts of money to use these parks. And in addition to the parks, there were new recreational facilities, such as the 11 astonishing pools that were opened in the fall of 1936 and are still in use. This one in Red Hook, Brooklyn, which was also in the center of Red Hook Park, newly built. And behind it, you can see the public housing, which was also part of the New Deal. And the green aspect, of course, of the public housing projects were the green spaces between the buildings and the parks and play areas for the children. Now, there's so much to say about the original Green New Deal, so we can only just look at the tip of the iceberg tonight. So I encourage you to go to our Roosevelt House website, take a look at our exhibits. We have a wonderful one on Arthur Rossi's photographs of the New Deal with many more pictures along with themes that I've given you tonight. And go to the Living New Deal website to obtain a map of all the New Deal, well, almost all the New Deal sites in New York City. There were so many they wouldn't all fit. And in fact, Mr. Kutner mentioned that the current New Deal, Living New Deal map has over 16,000 sites. There were probably 100,000 or 200,000 projects in the country yet to be reported on in that area. So thank you. Let me now introduce the next speaker, Julian Grave Neustat, who is a writer and the Vice President of Policy for the think tank Data for Progress. He is also a Native American activist working with others in the Pacific Northwest to preserve the natural environment.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I think that we're all going to look really bad compared to your slides with your beautiful photos. Billy was actually just texting me about how we're all going to look like slackers compared to you with your awesome slides. So thank you for that. I'll be honest, and pardon me for not coming more prepared, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to talk about today. It's such a big subject, and I felt like what I should say should be additive rather than sort of a prepared little thing that I bring over like it's my science experiment in school or something. And I think that what Bob Kutner said in his keynote, as well as Mr. Silver, obviously also I've read a lot of Kevin Baker's writing on this subject, is going to contribute to what I'm about to sort of outline, the point I'm about to make. I think that there's a lot of ways that this panel can go. I think a lot of it so far has focused more on sort of policy and the legacy of the New Deal, the parts of that we need to grapple with and learn from and bring into the 21st century, the parts of that need to change. But I live here in Washington, D.C., where a huge part of getting the New Deal done was not just the sort of New Deal policies, the WPA, the TVA, all of that, but was also the art of putting together political coalitions, of getting 50 senators, or in historical instances, 60 senators to vote for something, to get 280 representatives to vote for something, and of course, getting something signed into law by a president. And my brief remarks today are effectively going to suggest that the set of political strategies and tactics that have successfully popularized the Green New Deal, that have forced it into the center of Democratic Party politics, the fact that it was even a thing that was discussed by both candidates on stage last night, where they had to state their positions on it. That set of strategies, tactics, activist sort of ways of engaging in politics are actually going to be quite distinct from the set of skills and strategies and tactics that it's going to take to do the addition of putting together a coalition and getting the number of votes, the organizations behind those, and ultimately also the voters in 2022 and beyond who can make this into a durable set of laws. Because of course, even if we do pass something in 2021 or thereafter, that's not going to, if it gets repealed later by Republicans, that will not have been up to the task, particularly the task of fighting climate change and decarbonization, because we need to sustain deep decarbonization going on into the future if we are going to have a fighting chance at taking on global warming. So I wanted to first sort of outline the series of things that I've gotten to be part of and seen up close around how the Green New Deal came to be, and the ways that those are going to have to sort of slightly shift if the same folks on the progressive side of the aisle are going to have a chance at making this thing into not just a slogan, but actually a law. So I guess I'd start with a story, which was that I'm sitting here in my apartment in Washington, D.C., and about 2 years ago, there's this cheap beer garden just like a few blocks from here called Glenn's Market. Folks who've looked for a cheap drink in DC might know Glenn's. There's a little patio area where you can sit outside and have beers with friends. And I was sitting with a few of the leaders of this youth group that nobody at that moment in history had really heard of, unless you were deeply involved in activist circles, and particularly actually just environmental activist circles. And that was called the Sunrise Movement. Of course, everybody on this call has probably heard of the Sunrise Movement at this point, but back then nobody knew who they were or what they were up to. And they were telling me this sort of crazy idea that they had, and I'll admit that I did think it was a little crazy, where after the midterm elections, a set of elections that ultimately would actually not be delivered by progressives, but would be delivered arithmetically by moderates, by folks who swung suburban districts back to Democrats, who were going to lead a sit-in. This youth group was going to lead a sit-in in the soon-to-be speaker's office, saying that the IPCC report had just come out, that we had 12 years, and that she needed to embrace this thing that we didn't actually really have a name for yet, but was either being called a green job guarantee, a climate job guarantee, building on this notion of a federal job guarantee, or as a placeholder, the Green New Deal. And it really was, I will say, kind of a placeholder that people were using that hadn't been applied to the slogan just yet. If you actually look at some of the photos of the first Sunrise Action in Pelosi's office, they don't even have shirts or banners that say Green New Deal quite yet. Those actually didn't come until later. And that was because it was kind of a last minute decision to call it the Green New Deal. And what the central sort of strategy of this, this action, which I didn't think was going to work, because I was like, why are people going to listen to us, these kids, talking about this crazy left-wing idea when we have no political leverage? We didn't win the majority of elections here. In fact, actually, just the same day as Democrats retook the House, we lost a ballot initiative for a progressive carbon tax that was kind of a Green New Deal-esque idea, where you tax carbon and reinvest it into progressive things. In the other Washington State, the one that's like, supposed to be a super deep blue liberal bastion of like rational policy ideas, it got voted down by the voters in Washington State that exact same day. And so I was like, well, why is Pelosi and all these other people, going to listen to these activist kids? And it turned out that they had a better reading. They'd been of social movements, of activist theory, and of the sorts of strategies that can drive a wedge, create sort of a media moment, and then force journalists and politicians, really crucially, to sort of take a side in how they're going to talk about the issue of the day. And so by launching this really audacious sit-in in Speaker Pelosi's office, they incepted this notion of the Green New Deal into Democratic politics and forced in very quick succession virtually every Democrat to have a stated position on it. So if you actually look back at the coverage of the early days of the Green New Deal, folks like, not even just on the left, but folks like Amy Klobuchar, the senator from Minnesota, actually said that she was for the Green New Deal because it had become this big, exciting idea that everybody, wanted to sort of hop on board or take a position on. At the same time, some other politicians felt like the Green New Deal was challenging their power, was, obviously challenging their soon-to-be speaker, and that they couldn't stand for something like that these kids were, out of line in their actions. And I've seen that tactic, that tactic of driving a wedge and then forcing Democrats to take a side, repeated across sort of activist politics, whether it be from issues like the $15 minimum wage, Medicare for all, the Dakota Access Pipeline, a campaign that actually specifically brought me into climate politics. And it does seem to actually really work. It succeeds at making issues into the issues of the day, ones that politicians have to take a side on, that brings activist and left-wing demands into the media environment, and it acquaints, broader media viewers with those ideas, and then sort of educates them about, broader ideas of public roles in the economy, a more social democratic way of doing healthcare, for example. And in this instance, a really robust public-led fight against climate change, a fight that's going to create jobs, that's going to build out infrastructure, that's going to create standards for carbon reductions and shares of renewables on the grid, and all of that. And it has worked time and again at creating sort of momentum and attention on left-wing demands. But it's actually exactly that sort of driving a wedge and forcing people to take a side on it that At this moment in the game, as Democrats are headed towards an election in November, as there's the potential, as the Cook Political Report and others have projected, of Democrats taking a trifecta. They put it at 68%. And of course, that's what is going to be needed to have anything in the semblance of a Green New Deal. It's exactly that sort of muscle memory of driving wedges and forcing people to take a side that could either help the fight for a Green New Deal if it's done in a tactful way, if it's done in a way that allows Democrats to take a side on something that's good, or it's actually, unfortunately, the exact sort of maneuvers that could divide a very tenuous coalition that includes, the activists who fight pipelines and the labor unions that build them, that could actually sort of kill any sort of shot at a Green New Deal. And so I think that part of the story behind all of these great policy ideas that we have, the potential for them to happen, is this really delicate dance, the art of doing politics, wherein I think a lot of the folks like me, the young people like me who have come up in an era where we've learned to pick fights with the party that we tend to vote for over policy issues that are on the left, are going to have to also learn how to win people over on net to some of our positions, which might mean not driving the wedges and not protesting the speaker in some instances, and learning how to work with them, which is a quite distinct set of ways of doing things than actually brought the Green New Deal into an existence. And I think that's where I'd like to leave it off, is that to make a Green New Deal happen, a lot of folks are going to have to start learning how to do politics together, who in very recent memory were on opposite sides of the sit-in.
Okay, and
I
Julian,
I think I have to introduce the
yeah.
next person. I'm so sorry. I
No problem.
forgot about that duty. Okay, so it's my honor and privilege, even though I forgot to do it, to introduce our next speaker, who is Alyssa Iturbe. She teaches at the Yale School of Architecture, where she leads the design studios, as well as a seminar called The City and Carbon Modernity. She also coordinates the dual degree program between the Yale School of Architecture and the Yale School of the Environment, and is an adjunct assistant professor at the Cooper Union. She is co-founder of Outside Development, a design and research team that considers race, class, labor, and capitalism alongside form, proportion, and the production of urban fabric. So, Alyssa, the Zoom is yours.
Hi, thanks, Julian. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share a few slides. So let me just open that up. And I'm going to be brief, but essentially I want to pick up on the idea of a just transition, which we've already talked about quite a bit, but as an architect and someone that's interested in built form and its relation to climate, one question that I have been asking is what might a just transition for architecture be, especially in light of the fact that as architects, or let's say the typical production of architectural form, involves replicating patterns of construction and material extraction that we know to cause climate change. So if we think about the patterns of our built form, they reflect petromobility, they're shaped by access to dense and abundant energy, and not just spaces of transit and suburbs and stadia, et cetera, but also just also the architectural objects that we sort of fetishize in a way, that we are accustomed to ways of designing that take as a basic assumption access to dense and abundant energy. So it's this question of transition is important, and it's not just a design problem, though. It's not something that we can just sort of design away, that if the buildings look different or operated differently, there would be a sort of deep structural solution to this. There's a structural problem in the profession as well. And because that's because architects make a living from a carbon economy just as much as other kinds of workers do. So I really like this analysis of the Seagram building by Keel Mo, right, where he looks at the metabolic facts of a building, and he looks at just the role that energy has played, or the necessity of dense and abundant energy, and simply allowing the formation of this building. So we can see it as a disciplinary problem and one that involves building systems, but I think it's also important to think about the corollary of livelihood, right? Because as architects, we make our livelihood from energy intensive building practices. So I think we have to think about the design questions, but we also have to think about these structural questions for the profession. And so during the summer, during the Black Lives Matter uprisings, there was an anonymous protest organized online called a Pencils Down protest. And I thought this was an interesting thing by designers, which, or it's a sort of a statement of solidarity by designers with the Black Lives Matter protest. And it essentially is a statement that says that our role in the production of the built environment was complicit with racist policies, with creating segregated cities, with creating gentrification that displaces people and creates more segregation. But there also, through the act of having it be a pencils down protest, there's a recognition of complicity there, a recognition by architects and others that work in architecture and design to say, we recognize that our work is part of this, and so we will withdraw our labor for however many hours you could pledge, as many hours as you felt that you could. And so there's something interesting in recognizing complicity, but then also recognizing the sort of the power that designers have as workers, and recognizing our role in the production of a built environment that's no longer tenable. And so this has an idea embedded in it that if we stop working, we could interrupt capital flows, a sort of vision as to what it means to perhaps organize this kind of resistance within design. And I think that this work needs to continue also within climate, because the production of architecture reproduces and worsens the climate crisis. And we can see that our livelihood is directly tied to fossil fuels just as much as coal miners, just as much as workers in the petroleum industry, because we're workers within the industry of private development, which, as we know, is essentially just churning up the earth to create luxury condos and other typologies that are highly energy intensive. So this is a drawing by Rania Gosin of Design Earth, which implies the extraction that is necessary for every building that is produced. So I think what this means for architecture is an important question. I think what I'm referring here to the just transition, because in the case of fossil fuel workers, we talk about it sometimes as a question of retraining or of finding jobs elsewhere, of sort of transitioning people into a different kind of work. But what it means for architecture might be a bit more difficult, as designers tend to see design more as a way of life or a mode of thought. And I don't know the answer, but I think that as a start, architects should articulate their own demands of Green New Deal legislation. And perhaps that might mean demanding, for example, publicly funded projects, so that we weren't so subservient to private development, so that we didn't feel like our design work was always in the service of creating a profit for a development project. That architecture isn't simply about kind of decorating this, the embodiment of a process that's far beyond our reach. But if we could think about public projects that were held accountable through some sort of democratic process, if we knew that there was this larger initiative towards decarbonization that we could be part of and that we could contribute our work to, that could be something that a just transition could be like for architects and for designers. Maybe it also means to support educational reform. The equivalent of our retraining in architecture might be support for understanding the ecological consequences of built form a little bit better. So all of these, I think, are really important questions. And I have to point here to the work of the Architecture Lobby, which has a Green New Deal working group, which I'm a part of. And we've been having a lot of conversations around this as to what our demand should be of Green New Deal legislation. But the point that I want to make today, which is a simple one, is simply to say that I think all of us, we're in this moment of climate emergency. It's a moment of all hands on deck. And so everyone has to ask themselves how their own lives will be transformed in this transition, and how what we do contributes to the climate crisis in our own ways. But I think specifically it's very important to move past simply a sense only of individual responsibility, which has dominated environmental discourse for far too long. So, picking up on what Julian was saying, the question of how we organize is essential, and the kind of work that is involved in the political transition that will lead to the energy transition is essential. And so I think we have to ask how our own work contributes to the structural forces that shape the climate crisis. And the Green New Deal is, of course, still amorphous, but I think that that's an opportunity to make demands and to shape it so that we can find specific avenues by which we can have more agency over what we do and what we make in our own work, so that we can be less dependent on energy intensive modes of production. So that's all I was going to say. And so I'm going to introduce the next speaker, who is Billy Fleming. And let me stop my screen share, though, before I tell you all the amazing things about Billy. Okay. So Billy is the director of the McClarg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a senior fellow with Data for Progress. He's also a leading voice in connecting the Green New Deal to design work, definitely a leader in that area. He's currently spearheading the Green New Deal Super Studio, which is taking architecture and landscape architecture programs by storm, an idea where architecture schools and within design education, we're putting the Green New Deal at the center of that conversation, and then linking people across schools to have that conversation together. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Billy Fleming.
Thanks so much, Alyssa, and thanks so much to Peggy and everyone else for having us here and for all the wonderful remarks and comments. And I think I'll try to go quick here and pull a few of these kind of disparate threads together between sort of history and politics and architecture and infrastructure before I hand it back to Kevin to really pull us into the Q&A. And I think that requires us to maybe begin by just kind of like thinking about the mythology of the New Deal, and two things in particular that are often, I think, inappropriately sort of assigned to it when it's discussed in this Green New Deal context. The first being the idea of New Deal as some massive top-down operation in which power and control in the federal government were really centralized. And outside of the TVA, really that's just fundamentally untrue. And to sort of steal a line from the excellent book Shaped by the State, which is really about 20th century liberalism and neoliberalism from Brent Siebel and some colleagues, they refer to it as really and truly a partnership. And thinking of the New Deal as really this mass transfer of federal funds to state and local government, where questions about implementation were really left up to existing power structures there. And it's what allowed what they call sort of urban liberalism and sanitary or sewer socialism to sort of coexist with Sunbelt conservatism in the same investment program. The other is that there's a pretty well and coordinated, the idea of the New Deal as a well-coordinated and strategic effort, when in fact it was quite ad hoc, quite experimental, and many parts of it failed quite quickly and were scrapped and forgotten, either because the court struck them down or because they were actually like quite bad ideas. And I think it sort of speaks to the idea that has long been drummed out of public discussion in the United States, the government as a sort of innovator or experimenter in chief, and was really something that FDR and his colleagues took seriously. And so I think with those in mind, it's important to think about what the New Deal made possible. And maybe to begin to do so with a line from a very long essay I wrote, which I will not impose upon you, about 18 months or so ago in Places Journal, that was just surprisingly and newly recirculated this week in New York Times Magazine by Nikhil Sabal, which is that no one will really understand climate action, whether it's through a Green New Deal or some other investment program, through the electrons or electricity or molecules or carbon of the transition. And put another way, you'd never walk into your office at home, power up your laptop for an event like this and notice that it's powered by wind instead of coal or natural gas. But what you will notice through the kinds of investments that a Green New Deal makes possible are the material benefits that it produces in buildings and landscapes and public works and parks and infrastructure in your everyday life. And it's, that's also, I think, something outlined in a great piece last fall from Diana Budds at Curved, who began to sort of think about the kind of world building the Green New Deal really dares us to imagine. And we've talked a little bit about the TVA today. I want to talk about a few of the other alphabet agencies too, but through the Tennessee Valley Authority and the other sort of less sexy, but I think much more important electricity alphabet agency, the Rural Electrification Administration, during the period of the New Deal and a little beyond, we take rural electrification rates in the United States from 10% to 97%, and almost exclusively at rates that were thought impossible by the private utilities who, in the first 2 years or so of the New Deal, really challenged FDR's approach to this. So he initially imagined the REA as simply a bank for private utilities to expand from urban markets to rural markets. For about 18 months, they continuously came back to him with proposals that were 3 and 4 and 5 times larger than he thought it would cost. So in year 2, he said, to hell with you, I'll do this myself through the REA. And over the course of the New Deal, spends about the equivalent of $200 billion or so in adjusted dollars to build out our rural electrification infrastructure. Gives us 380,000 or so miles of transmission line, which is about 40% of all the transmission line ever built in the history of the United States. The TVA itself sort of blends this brutal efficiency, the construction of its hydroelectric power system, with this really imaginative and truly spectacular and provocative approach to both the architecture of the dams themselves and their approach to the landscape architecture of the Tennessee Valley, in large part because the TVA was run by architects and landscape architects. And contrary to some of the, again, like the myth making that circulated about the REA and the TVA, with some exceptions for the TVA, it did so largely not by opposing private markets or new markets, but actually trying to open them up. So while at the same time our sort of comrades in Europe were really focused on public investment that could decommodify things like electricity and water, the New Deal was quite focused, particularly through the TVA, in opening up new rural commodities markets for utilities who previously had sort of told the government they couldn't afford to do business there, and with electric appliance manufacturers who were desperate for more customers and could not see a way to make it pencil out to go into these places initially. And actually the conflict between the TVA and the Georgia Power Company is part of what drives Wilkie to run against FDR a few years later. And outside of those 2 big electrification agencies, we also have the CAA, the predecessor to the FAA, the Civil Aeronautics Authority, which produces almost nation's municipal airport infrastructure over the course of the New Deal, spends about $1 trillion or so in adjusted funds over the course of the New Deal to do this, roughly half of what nominee Biden has promised for his COVID stimulus package. And it does it to build up municipal airports, which include some that are still in operation today, like Midway in Chicago. And then beyond that, I'm not going to go through all of the alphabet agencies because that would take the rest of the night, but thinking about the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the PWA, and the WPA, they're also tasked with a lot of the less sexy projects, or the ones that prove to be quite durable, both in their literal durability in the physical landscape, but also in their ability to bind local elected officials and elites to the idea of local infrastructure production. So they build our schools and post offices, our sanitary sewers and bridges and tunnels, but they also build our leisure infrastructure, the places we could go to get away from the drudgery of work and the specter of war, whether it was in the nearly 1,000 or so state parks that were built and planned during this period, and done so, by the way, often on a shoestring, sort of at the last moment, by architects on site who had no plan before they showed up and were told to design something that could be built with hand tools, both because it was cheaper and because it meant more people had work to do when they were built with hand tools. And I say all that because I think, again, it's easy for us to sort of mythologize the New Deal and to ignore some of the more noir sides to it, right? Which we talked a little bit about tonight, but not a ton. And part of this is because the New Deal required, or at least FDR, in FDR's estimation, required a compromise with Southern Dixiecrats who, along with far more, I think, Northern liberals than we tend to acknowledge, used this massive transfer of funds from the New Deal to state and local government to lengthen and strengthen the tendrils of Jim Crow and white supremacy in most of our cities and communities. It's part of why the TVA, in its construction, offered very few jobs, less than 2% of all jobs on the North Stand, the kind of signature dam of the TVA, to Black folks in Tennessee Valley, and set out to then build a set of racially segregated facilities, both bathrooms and water fountains and other facilities on site. And this, of course, says nothing of the Farm Security Administration's pretty explicit focus on using the instruments or organs of government to dispossess Black farmers of their land, which is a process that is still very fervently underway today. And I think, to begin to take us into this particular moment, I was really glad to hear Bob's remarks on ARA, the Obama stimulus, which, really, I think fundamentally represents almost a sort of inverse of the approach that Green New Dealers have taken thus far, and in large part because it really explicitly sought to submerge what government was doing or what was possible through government. The economic architects of nudge behavioral econ, like Cass Sunstein and Austin Goolsbee, who fought really hard and very loudly on TV and in op-eds all over the country to be sure that no one could actually viscerally understand what the stimulus package was doing for them in their everyday lives. They were quite clear that this was a goal of the plan. And recognizing, again, that like part of what ARA, the Obama stimulus, required, which I think actually was quite a reasonable standard for the projects it produced, was that they be shovel ready. And so Alyssa mentioned this Green New Deal Super Studio that we're coordinating now in the McCarty Center at Penn with a bunch of other partners. The idea there is that we sort of recognize that this is, whether it's through nominee Biden or someone else in a few years, that there is going to be another major injection of money for stimulus and public works and other kinds of built environment investments coming down the road relatively soon. And that the only way to ensure that those investments go towards locking in lower carbon futures and more just futures is if we have the sort of projects on the books that can compete with the honestly like really shitty infrastructure projects that tend to get built with this kind of money and that got built through ARA and the Obama stimulus. And so part of what this super studio is doing is getting the conceptual sort of gears turning to produce the kinds of images that can lead to those projects within the next year, maybe 1 to 5 year time horizon. And the last thing I would just offer before I turn it back to Kevin here is that, I think for all the imperfections of the Green New Deal and certainly of the New Deal, it remains the only serious climate plan on the table in the United States. The only one that even attempts to fuse the more technocratic concerns of, say, carbon emission reduction with the demands of workers for jobs and a more just economy, with the demands of frontline communities for justice as a sort of centerpiece in the investment side of this. So thinking about carbon, jobs, and justice as a kind of set of pillars that hold the Green New Deal together. When you look back to the sort of closest we came to anything at the scale of this in the last 10, 15, 20 years at Waxman-Markey, it was a purely technocratic plan, fought at every sort of step of the way by the environmental justice community, and probably rightfully so. They fought a version of this in California and lost. But even under that plan, the closest the most optimal implementation of it would have taken us to a 4.2 degrees Celsius warming world without any of the material economic investments in people in place that a Green New Deal kind of offers to us. And so with that in mind, I think there's just a couple of questions I'll foreground here before I hand it back to Kevin. One is just, I think Bob raised this question, but I want to foreground it again, just this really impossible tension and unanswered question of how to balance the speed that the Green New Deal demands to build the most stuff we've ever built faster and better than we've ever built it, with our desire to live up to small d democracy and self-determination. We probably can't do both, and we definitely cannot afford to figure that out on the back end of this. And then the second is just to, I think, reiterate an argument that my friend and colleague here at Penn, Daniel Donacohen, made a couple years ago, to treat this Green New Deal as a sort of last stimulus, a way to lock in lower carbon, more disastrous path for the future. So with that, I will stop talking and hand it back to Kevin.
My screen's frozen here. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, okay, here we go. Can people hear me okay? Yep, okay. Okay, thanks so much for that. Yeah, all of a sudden this got unstable here. Thanks so much for that, Mr. Fleming. Thanks everybody for all your statements and photos. That was terrific. I thought I would, kind of go with a few questions here that we've been getting, and we go on. Just want to make sure everybody. Okay. All right. So just to start off with a question directed directed at Mr. Noisecat. You know, as was touched on by a number of people here, taken on indigenous forests and of European settlements in North America. Of course, there have also been this terrible of years of centuries of genocidal policies directed against indigenous people, as well as centuries of exploitation and suppression of people of color throughout the United States. The New Deal did something toward this, addressed this in some ways through and things such as the Black Cabinet and the so-called Indian New Deal, and did enough, I guess, to bring many people of color from the party of Lincoln into the party of Roosevelt, where they still are today. But of course, as many people have touched on, this was not done, you know, it's inequitably done. And the trouble is that the people doing it, people in the Roosevelt administration, while there was plenty of racism, but were probably overall the least racist white people in American government at the time, and yet were not able to overcome these significant barriers against a more equitable distribution and push forward. So I was wanting to start with you, like, how do we learn from that and avoid doing that again? When obviously, as we've seen this year, race is still such a huge issue in the United States and still so unresolved. How do we take that lesson better this time?
I got about half of that. I missed the first half, but my understanding of the question is how do.
I was just saying how while the New Deal, you know, addressed issues of people of color for maybe the first time the national government had, at least since Reconstruction, and in many cases probably before that, nonetheless, it fell short in terms of there being this sort of inequitable, distribution of benefits and of rights to indigenous peoples, to people of color. There were real efforts toward it. You know, there was the so-called Indian New Deal, and there was things like the Black Cabinet, but it still was not an equitable, you know, approach. And this was despite the fact that these were some of the least racist people in government who were trying to carry out these programs, yet were not able to get it done more equitably. What can we learn from that? How do we overcome that this time around?
Yeah, I guess I'll keep it really short. I mean, my general read of the New Deal is that, specifically with regard to tribal communities, is that it cuts in multiple directions at the same time. So, you know, on the one hand, you have the so-called, as you said, Indian New Deal, the sort of like keystone of which is the Indian Reorganization Act, which on the one hand provides, you know, greater sovereignty and self-determination for tribes. On the other hand, it foists sort of a cookie cutter model developed, in Washington, D.C. onto tribes across the country, which creates enduring problems that actually sort of rear their head again at Standing Rock and elsewhere. At the same time, sort of the model from the TVA leads to the development of things like the Pick-Sloan dams later in the 40s and 50s. The Pick-Sloan dams are exactly the same dams that flood tribal lands along the Missouri River, and similar sort of damming projects do the same. So there are these sort of legacies are cutting in sort of orthogonal directions. I guess sort of my initial response to that would be that I think that we need to stop aggregating people of color into, specifically in the environmental space, basically all people of color get aggregated into the environmental justice and climate justice sort of movement. And I think that that's not helpful. I think that that actually obscures more of the sort of coalitional interests of various constituencies more than it enlightens about them. And I think that there is, very specifically in my line of work, a lot more thinking that needs to go into, to Billy's point around, the environmental justice movement and communities opposing Waxman Markey last time around. There was a small, very insidery skirmish over a clean energy bill in the House of Representatives last week, where the environmental justice, at least a few environmental justice organizations, came out against it. And so I think that it's not impossible to imagine, first is tragedy, second, third time, fourth time, I don't know who's counting, as farce again. And I think that part of the beginning of getting around that problem is stopping to stop not aggregating people of color as one interest, and also thinking about what sorts of policies and priorities create coalition dynamics where, instead of different constituencies feeling as though they are at war with the bill or with other constituencies like labor and big green, how do you make people feel like they're all on the same page and moving in the same direction? We've been really bad at that.
All right, anybody else? Deborah?
Yeah, I like the points that were made by Billy about the local nature of many of the New Deal programs, that things came to the state and local governments, funding came to do projects, which made it possible in some areas to do things for African American communities, which might not be possible in other areas of the country. Harold Icke, who was Secretary of the Interior, an incredibly important figure in the New Deal, hundreds of millions of billions of dollars flowed under his decision-making, had been secretary of the NAACP chapter in Chicago before he came to Washington. And FDR didn't even really know him, but appointed him. And he was with the administration the entire Roosevelt presidency. Mary McLeod Bethune, an African-American educator, had met the Roosevelts in the 1920s and became a personal friend of Eleanor and Sarah and Franklin, and educated them about African-American life in this country, the lynchings, the segregation, the cruelties that were going on. And that was a very powerful influence on them, especially on Eleanor, who of course influenced Franklin in a kind of sideways manner. And she was in the National Youth Administration and made sure funding went to African American youth in the programs that were designed for all youth to be partly employed and partly to go to school. So yes, segregation was a fact of life, but it was differential depending on where you were and what agency. You have to realize what a long journey it had been from Woodrow Wilson, President Woodrow Wilson, who was an incredible racist and had basically thrown out African Americans from work in the federal government, to what the New Deal was doing. So in New York, for example, a group of African American artists were hired by the Federal Art Project and got to do individual art and public murals. In Alabama, the Cheese Bends community of African American sharecroppers became African American farmers who owned their own land via the Resettlement Administration. And I think you can find examples of that all over the country. So there is no monolithic treatment. As Julian suggests today, we shouldn't be looking at groups monolithically, even in the New Deal. And we should take from the New Deal's examples that we need to adjust what our projects are according to where they will be.
Yeah, that's a great point. Commissioner Silver, you had a great point on mentioning Robert Moses before the war and after the war, the good Moses and the bad Moses. And of course, in many ways, he was always the bad Moses, but he was a very useful public servant, I think, as long as he had elected politicians who were kind of riding herd on him, specifically, President Roosevelt, who viscerally hated him, and Mayor LaGuardia, who rather liked him, but knew how to keep him in line. So how do we deal with that today? I don't. One of the things that, for instance, Billy was mentioning, shovel-ready projects, which were sadly lacking in kind of the Obama stimulus package. Moses was very good at that. Kind of getting everybody together in Central Park in one building, having them produce all these shovel-ready projects that he'd had in mind for years, and brought out to the federal government. And the government, in New York City became sort of the model New Deal city because of that, and got a tremendous amount of New Deal money. How do we keep some new bureaucracy that will be, looked upon with skepticism by Americans, under political control, and in line for that? What kind of political effort will that be? Oh, you're still muted.
All right. For one, I don't know the procurement process that existed under Moses. And when I look at the WPA of how people were put to work is not done that way today. It's done by firms. And so it's always hard to compare what happened under the New Deal and what could happen today. Even if we have big infrastructure projects, there'll be large A&E firms, architecture and engineering firms getting these jobs, and will it trickle down to the middle class and average workers, where the WPA was able to put a lot of people to work? So construction methods are different. The way we build things today are different. And so I'm not an expert to know what the procurement rules back then. There will never be another Robert Moses. There was a way to make sure he did not amass that much power and be head of so many different agencies. And so I don't think we'll see a repeat of Robert Moses. And so every time I hear the shovel ready, we have a lot of projects in the shovel ready. The question is, how do you get them out the door? How do you procure them to get the work started, which to me is a major difference. So if there is a New Deal, we're going to have to take a hard look at procurement reform. If in fact there's going to be an army of individuals ready to work, even if it's just minor labor, to me that has to be part of it. And if we're going to educate the next workforce on what those green jobs look like, we have to be able to make sure it passes through these large firms directly to the individuals so that they get employed. And so I don't know what that structure looks like, but to me, that is the major lessons learned. One, Robert Moses will never amass, no individual will amass that much power as they have in the past. Number two, procurement and how work is done today is quite different. But there's no question, if we are going to explore something like some version of a Green New Deal, we have to have that labor force ready to go, that they can go ahead and do the work without going through the normal channels that we've had today.
Yes, speed is definitely a huge thing, which Professor Kutner mentioned in part, and that seems to be one of the main challenges, how quickly we have to do this. You were going to say something, Bob?
Yeah, I'm sorry. And under our current procurement laws, it can take you anywhere 2 to 3 years just to go through the procurement process before you get a shovel in the ground. So I remember when the whole conversation was occurring, even under the Obama administration, about shovel ready. I mean, you've got to be pretty advanced, but our current procurement rules just slows everything down. So rather than having red tape, we need a green tape initiative to expedite procurement processes, to make them go a lot faster, and to take out all of these. I know there's a concern about corruption, but there's a way it can be done. We built our system to avoid the 1 or 2 bad apples, and we don't really reward those who know how to get the stuff done quickly and get projects in the ground and get going.
I love green tape.
Yeah,
Yes?
coming back on that, I think what we need to do is recreate public institutions. The New Deal was built on public institutions. And if we have to go through the private sector to do all this, it's not going to work. We need public banking. We need a Reconstruction Finance Corporation. We need public entities that don't have to go through private procurement processes, so that the power of government, a la TVA, a la REA co-ops, to do things directly that benefit regular people can be demonstrated once again. The public sector is actually a lot more efficient than the private sector in many respects. This is what the rural electrification proved. Roosevelt famously spoke about yardstick competition, where you have public entities to demonstrate what the real price is if the private sector were operating efficiently. So you're turning 80 years of conventional wisdom on its head and reverting to the idea that government is often the most efficient as well as the most equitable player.
That's yeah, that's a great point, and that's also the point that Billy made about the Rural Electrification Administration and how instrumental that was in doing that. What all this leads us, though, to is also sort of the inherent conflict going on that was touched on by Alyssa, I believe, about local control and how does that come up against national goals or more regional goals. And also several people have talked about in terms of retraining, it's kind of forgotten now, but the point that one of the things Hillary Clinton really got hit for in 2016 was when she was saying a lot of miners are going to lose their jobs. And what the Republicans did was cut off the next thing she says, which is that we have to find a way to get them new jobs. So, just to start with Elisa here, what do we do to kind of minimize those conflicts between local areas and these sort of broader national or even global goals? How do we, align those interests?
I think it's a really difficult problem, right? It's a really difficult question. And I mean, at least in the area of architecture, the question of retraining is one that is very complicated. And, in terms of the pedagogy of the schools and in terms of how we teach, and also the fact that architecture requires many different kinds of skills, right? So it already is sort of a heterogeneous education where you have to learn to draw, but you also have to learn history, you also have to learn theory, you also have to learn structures, right? So there is a gap, right, in understanding the climate crisis and really understanding the intersection between what we do, not just in terms of how we build, but also how we think about space, and how we think about ecologies. And so that and, architectural education, there's a gap, right? So, what would a retraining mean? I think it can mean many things. And I think that we have to also think about not just geographically local versus regional, but also cross-sector, and what is the relationship between architects and construction workers and engineers, right? Because we all produce the built environment in conjunction. So how do we think across sectors? That, I think, is a prerequisite to thinking across scales, because otherwise large regional projects may just come in as top-down, very problematic, erasure of local conditions. So we need this interdisciplinary, cross-sector, interscalar way of thinking. That definitely involves retraining. I don't know exactly how or what the tools are, but I think that this is a question we have to ask ourselves. And I think I totally agree with Billy about the need for shovel-ready projects, but I think in my experience as a designer and being an educator in architecture right now is that we're not ready to produce those shovel-ready projects because we don't necessarily have the knowledge that we need, or the kind of the vision that we need, or the understanding of territorial ecologies that we need to make sure that the built projects that we do are appropriate for a climate that's in total crisis. So I think that it's all hands on deck. It's all hands on deck across the board. And it has to do with how we educate. It has to do with how we build. And it has to do with how we relate to each other in our own fields and to other fields around us.
Let me jump in.
And move on. I'm sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to, if I could, just jump in for just a second on that.
I was going to turn to you next in any case, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I think to kind of extend a few of Elise's points and to maybe connect us back to the previous question from Mitchell and Bob, I think we don't talk much about the importance or the centrality of the building and trades unions to this conversation, right? The people who literally build and maintain the cities and towns that we all live in and take for granted. And often the way their work is structured is to kind of have to, by necessity, to have to ignore some of these smaller and medium-sized projects that either aren't as lucrative, aren't as reliable, and to chase these mega projects because they're forced to operate in such, an environment of scarcity, thinking about the kinds of work that their members are going to take on and what they can do to sort of guarantee the kind of security that unions have been chartered to offer to them. And so, I think again, treating, especially building and trade union workers, but all sort of union workers involved in this, not as a tension to resolve, but a constituency to reward for through the kinds of material investments that only a national scale coordinated plan and investment program like a Green New Deal can make possible. It has to be a bigger part of this conversation. And I think related to that, to maybe tie more directly to Elise's point, is, most of our federal bureaucracy is staffed still at 1986, 87 levels. And that was true before Donald Trump became president. We've held our bureaucracy in check for a very long time and have left them really incapable of being able to meet their regulatory and enforcement and management mandates. The same is true, often to a lesser degree, certainly in wealthier cities like New York and San Francisco, but often it's quite pronounced in other places, and it's still a problem there, that federal, state, and local bureaucracies suffer from the same kinds of challenges. And so it's often forgotten that one of the things the New Deal did, besides offer a kind of blue-collar jobs guarantee through the CCC to mostly young men, I think as Deborah mentioned, it also had a soft white-collar jobs guarantee, because this was also a moment of profound sort of rupture in the architecture, engineering, and construction industry during the New Deal. And one of the ways that Roosevelt and others dealt with that was to just massively expand the in-house expertise on the planning, management, and design side of the federal bureaucracy. And sometimes that meant, literally populating what would become kind of the appendages of HUD and the Department of Transportation and other, the Army Corps of Engineers, with people from those professions whose firms were going under. But it also meant providing money to state and local government to hire them on to do the same. And so the New Deal emerged at a time of just profoundly undeveloped statecraft in the United States. And I think we're coming to a moment now where actually our state is quite large and well developed. It needs lots of new things, but one of the things it also needs is just to actually provide funding to operate it at the level it was designed to operate. We've been operating at 80% capacity or less in the federal and state and local government for a very long time.
Yeah, great point. And one of the things I was going to put to you, but anybody can chime in here on. You were mentioning kind of that the TVA is sort of maybe the overrated star of the New Deal in some ways, and that's probably true compared to a lot of the things like the RFC, that the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that Bob mentioned, and the REA. But it was incredible in what a multiplier it was. I mean, you go into this really devastated region and you build these great big things. Touching upon Alyssa and structures and all, dams, which we have a lot of qualms about today. But you build these big dams, and you also though create these programs to heal the land, to get people an education, to get people jobs. You create a recreation area. You create the power that goes into everything from the Muscle Shoals music industry to building part of the A-bomb. You even create libraries in conjunction with the local librarian Toby Rothrock, which is this tremendous advance, and I think does have a great power in the sense of saying how all these things can come out of something like new energy. Is there anything we can imagine like that we can do today? Is there any kind of idea like that's just out there and need funding?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I'm sure others will want to jump in, but a couple things I would say are, it's pretty incredible what the federal government can do when it has a mission and goals and funding, which we've had none of the three for most of my adult lifetime. I think even looking at ARA, again, the Obama stimulus in 2009, I wasn't there for its passage, but I was around in government for its implementation, and was purposely designed to be too small. I think both the Obama and EC advisors and others thought they'd be able to go back to the well to Congress to be able to get more money if and when they needed it. I think we now kind of understand how foolish that strategy was. And, you know, thinking about a Green New Deal, or even say a more muted $2 trillion recovery package from then President Biden, as something that includes what are called automatic stabilizers. So things that trigger recurring stimulus every year or every couple of years until a certain set of conditions are met, have to also be, I think, a part of this conversation. The other thing I would say too, so in addition to just thinking about you know, what stimulus can provide here, is that, you know, most of what comes out of like a mission or goals or purposefully driven kind of package, like a Green New Deal, like the New Deal offered, is less about like things to rally people around and more about ways to open up sort of new industries. And so as we think about like this question of both like literal communities of people and geographic communities, there are going to be places like any other like large global or national transition that are win and lose. And thinking about like how to treat this investment program as a way to like accelerate the wins in places that are going to be obvious winners, like the Midwest, where you're going to produce a ton of wind and even some solar energy, and places that are going to lose, honestly, as a result of some of the things here. And how you channel investment to those folks is hugely important. And I say that because, you know, I think to Mitchell's point about you know, having New York having this kind of suite of projects that either are or could be quickly made shovel ready. New York's on like the short list of a couple cities where that's ever going to be possible in the United States. And you know, Manhattan at least, and then certainly San Francisco, Chicago, a handful of other cities are probably going to figure 90% or so of this out, with or without a sort of federal or national Green New Deal. Might not be exactly as they would want it, but thinking about both like the mid-sized towns or communities or cities in the Midwest and in the Appalachian Mountains, in the Mississippi Delta, in the Southwest, and Big Sky Country, those are the places that, when you think about like the justice component to what a Green New Deal can offer, that I think, again, belong more at a more central place in this conversation. And we're working on something now in the center that takes three of those places: the Appalachia region, which includes something called the Appalachian Regional Commission, a very underfunded, underauthorized, but still existing regional planning organization, of which we had very few in the United States. The same is true for the Mississippi Delta, which has the Delta Regional Authority. Again, super underfunded, lots of problems, but is an existing piece of statecraft that we haven't used very well. And then the Midwest, which has a few versions of this, and some of them include farmer and rural electric co-ops and other things. Thinking about those three regions as like the critical sites where the first round of investment should go. And I think, you know, Julian raised this point a little bit earlier, but thinking about, if you think about the Green New Deal as say like a decade of both like strategy and investment, thinking through where that first round of investment goes in a way that allows you to say, tackle the most technically difficult regions, so the places that you have to get right to achieve those jobs, justice, and carbon goals of the Green New Deal, and that allow you to grow your political coalition while you do that by making the material benefits really obvious and early to the people who live there. Again, it's like thinking through the political strategy. One of the things that has to be sort of front and center for Green New Dealers, if this is going to be more than a one-time $2 trillion stimulus and something more like a decade-long, in Trump's like dream world, $100 trillion stimulus, which he sort of teased for us last night.
Exactly. And to put through any of this, you need the romance of something, Deborah, you know, which you showed us a lot of with those pictures from the New Deal. I think that romance that's still there, it's still evident even in the the recently produced poster, but that evokes that era. So how do we bring that back? What is the you know, what is the way we sell that? I think that you know, I think it was Mario Cuomo who said that you govern in prose, but you campaign in poetry. What is the poetry we can evoke here, Deborah?
Well, I don't know if the poetry is, but I haven't heard much discussion of tax policy. I don't think tax policy was used very much during the original New Deal, but the Green New Deal could be quite important. For example, solar panels, encouraging people to put solar panels on their houses. There was a federal tax rate in New York, a state tax rate, and a city tax rate. And that's a micro level way of trying to address the carbon energy issue, if it was done on a large enough scale. I have solar panels on my house here in Brooklyn, And our block got together to do this, and with a local solar power company. And this is a kind of, and because of the tax credits, it made it very affordable. So this is very unpoetic, but it seems to me that in addition to the large projects that Billy is discussing, that we need also to think about how can we move things along on the local level. If you can engage people possibly getting solar panels, you then may be able to engage them on the next level up, because it's a pocketbook issue. And you could put solar panels on low income housing and people could save money. I mean, so there are ways that we haven't even discussed using kind of traditional tools like tax policy to advance a Green New Deal.
And there is poetry even in tax policy. And I think that's a good thing to remember. You know, many of our viewers have sent in questions that are much more kind of specific and wanting to know about the future here. You know, a lot of them revolve around jobs. How many jobs will a green economy generate? And we had one questioner who was wondering how many maintenance jobs there are in green energy. As I understand it, there are now more jobs in alternative energy than there are in traditional fossil fuel energy sectors. But I think the outlook is there are probably plenty of jobs to generate, to be generated here. Anybody want to that?
I think Saul Griffith and Rewiring America puts it at 25 million in the next few years. And I think that they ran 2 different kinds of models for that number.
The only thing I'd add to that, because I think that's right, is that maintenance and repair jobs in general, especially on infrastructure in the built environment, produce about 15% more jobs per dollar spent than new construction. So thinking about the upkeep of, say, public housing or bridges or tunnels versus the construction of highways to greenfield development, it's just a much more efficient and much more just use of the money.
Another point that Bob raised, which is first and foremost, stay alive, and I'm sure this is something that Silver must deal with all the time. How do we keep the flood waters from overwhelming us here? A few years ago, I went out and toured the East River and something of the harbor with Mayor Bloomberg and Amanda Burden and Cass Holloway. And they had, this was just months after Hurricane Sandy. And they had made a lot of changes in terms of making the New York's waterways more defensible. But they were still referring to Sandy as a once in 100 years event. And I question whether that was true then, and I don't think it's true now, unfortunately. But what are we looking at in terms of what we can do immediately to defend places like New York, all of Florida, and other coastal regions, not to mention all the places in the fire zones. Anybody want to take that up? Yeah,
I do. One, we looked at our own projections, and we have what we're doing right now is rebuilding a lot of our parks to 2050 levels. And so there is a controversial project that is about to start, East River Park, the same park you mentioned. We'll be elevating that park at the water's edge about 8 to 10 feet, which we believe will take us at least to 2050, 2060. But the public's struggling. They believe climate change. They believe that the sea is rising. But when they see how we have to address it, in the case of East River or what we're trying to do in Coney Island, people are now stuck with nostalgia versus protection. And so that's the challenge that we're currently facing. We're actually now going to put the storm surge protection at the water's edge and then slope the park down. In the Rockaways, we've rebuilt the entire boardwalk from wood to concrete. Coney Island's struggling with that because it's known as, the playground of New York, if not the United States. and they're struggling with moving away from basically the wood, which is chopping down Brazil in order to provide that tropical wood. So we do have a plan in place. To get there is going to be extremely difficult, but we are trying to fortify those vulnerable locations in the metro region. 2/3 of the population that's really within a storm surge location happen to be poor. And so for us, this is a very strong imperative to get it right. As I stated, $20 billion in order to address some of the sea level rise and storm surge issues. East River Park alone is about $1.4 billion to rebuild a park. It's about 40 acres. And so this is the reality that we're facing. It is going to be difficult going forward. If we're serious about climate change, our water's edge and that first line of defense is going to look very different than it had in the past. But it will produce jobs. Again, these are going to large construction firms. And this is something we're going to have to contend with. And we're doing this all over New York City.
Sort of a not in my backwater mentality. Yeah, it's interesting. And I guess things like, zoning will have to change somewhat. A few years ago, they rezoned Cook Island to bring in, I think it was like you could build 30 buildings of 30 stories in height. And boy, I looked at that and I thought, that's going to be the world's most expensive barrier reef in a few years, but it probably will bring in jobs. And labor has also been a big part of the questions we've been asked here. People kind of want to know, where are unions in tonight's discussion, and and why do we have to do large firms as opposed to, say, an expanded public workforce? These are some of the questions coming in from viewers. Anyone want to take that up?
Well, in terms right now, our procurement rules work that way. Depending on the size of the job, they are required to hire union labor. So that's just part of the process. In terms of getting the larger firms, they have the equipment, they have the subcontractors. The way current construction works, it is very complicated. And is it impossible to do it through the public sector? It isn't, but you have to purchase the equipment. And in terms of how many jobs you can do at once, like for example, a parks department, I'm managing close to 650 projects. My staff can maybe do 1 or 2 a year. We do on average about 150 projects a year. It's very difficult to do that in-house. We would need an army. Now, if that's what the New Deal is calling for, it's something that can be accomplished, but you're going to have a huge general contractor to oversee all that work to ensure that it's done by the public sector. It's not impossible, but there are a lot of procurement laws out there. There are MWBE requirements because we want to make sure we pass on those opportunities to other firms that are looked as the title states disadvantaged. And so not impossible, but I think we have to dream big. It can be done, but it's not going to be easy. Both the level, the scope, the scale, the work that needs to be done would make it very, very difficult for the public sector to take that on.
Other specific solutions people were wondering about, one was nuclear power. And, I don't know if anyone saw the piece today in the New York Times about potential advances at MIT in developing the spark reactor, small nuclear fusion reactor, which would be a whole different ballgame than fission, and which they're hoping to have ready next decade. Is that a reality, or are we better off with what we're already doing with solar and wind?
I'll throw caution to the wind on this one.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a bunch of essentially sort of inherited battle lines in the environmental movement. Nuclear is one of the biggest ones. It also happens to be really unpopular for basically Fukushima and 3 Mile Island related reasons, which isn't great because probably shouldn't be closing them right now, at the very least. I'm not a nuclear fan. The history of nuclear in this country really sucks, particularly for Native people, but it's also probably a really bad idea that when you're fighting climate change, you're going to take a bunch of zero carbon electricity off the grid. So I think more broadly, though, and this is not particular to nuclear, there are a set of sort of battle lines that exist in the environmental movement that if we are going to have any chance of building a coalition and sort of working towards a Green New Deal like, stimulus and set of policies and laws are going to have to be sort of worked around or set aside, maybe in the spirit of the original New Deal, sort of experimental and more open sort of philosophy towards governance. Other sort of battle lines that exist include carbon capture and storage, which is unproven, but which labor unions all say they really want, and which all the projected models say we need to utilize in one form or another, and probably at a large scale. Others include, the fight against pipelines and some of the more supply side battles that tend to divide the folks who fight the pipelines and the people who build them. A lot of the sort of traditional ways that the environmental movement has waged fights against infrastructure projects that we oppose might very easily be turned around against, and are actually already being turned around against offshore wind farms, for example, or wind developments or other, developments more generally. And we're going to really have to start getting around some of those sort of, I would say, Cold War and later sort of fights that the environmental movement has developed a set of strategies that they put into play again and again to make happen. That playbook is not going to work for building a historic amount of, clean energy and climate adaptation and resilient infrastructure.
Yeah, good point. And just to kind of, we're kind of getting on past our time here, but so just to ask Bob one more question here, and then we'll kind of wrap up, I think, and I'll turn it back over to Peggy to see us out. But I thought that was an excellent point about belt tightening, and then how belt tightening is not the way that we're going to go. And I know there was that Michael Moore produced movie out this year about how, alternative fuels won't do it. We just have to kind of, tighten our belts and get by. I think that's the worst way, as you were saying, to kind of approach the American public on this. I remember going to a peak oil seminar some years back, and somebody was very enthusiastically talking about how we were all going to learn to shear sheep. And I think, your average American would rather fill the sky with coal dust before they, kind of move back several centuries. But, so what, do we have to really then emphasize just how optimistic this is, how this is a new way of life, but it's really a better way of life, no? You're muted still there.
Yeah, it's redefining prosperity. I mean, so much of the green economy is a more reliable economy. And I think with all due respect to my friends who talk about degrowth, it's fine for a segment of the population. But when you think of all the working class people, people of color and white working class people who have not been sharing in the prosperity for the past 30 or 40 years, you're not going to sell them on degrowth. There's almost an arrogance to it. And especially since it is possible to have a better kind of prosperity if it's green prosperity.
All right. Well, thanks very much to everyone. That was a thoughtful discussion. There's much left to be discussed, and it will be, I think this will be kind of the dominant, one of the dominant political issues going forward. I hope it is, so something gets done. I want to thank you all for not talking over each other or just kind of rambling on in a crazy sort of way, despite the presidential example. Again, thanks so much for taking part. Thanks for everyone viewing this. And now back to Peggy.
Hello, everybody. Here I am again. I've actually been here the whole time, but thought better of intruding in on this conversation when it was really you guys who made it all happen. It was just fantastic. And, you know, I agree with all of you. What can I say? I think it obviously shows that we need to do more events of this kind. These kinds of conversations are actually desperately needed because, you know, it's one thing to have this fabulous aspirational thing called the Green New Deal, and it's another to begin to really flesh it out, which is what you've started to do, more than started, frankly. Anyway, thank you again. Thank you to all of our viewers. It's been just a great evening, and I really look forward to people's feedback, and we will be in touch. There will be a video which will be available soon, and I'll be in touch with everyone on the list who registered for the event and let you know when and where to see it. So that's it for now. And, you know, take heart, fortitude, courage as we go into this insane election season. I hope we win. That's all I can say. All right. Take care, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks, Peggy.
Bye.